Good morning, AP students. This is Mrs. Campbell Rhetoric, and I finally figured out how to record something on PowerPoint so that I could do your autumn school with you. I don't actually know where to look. Do I look there? Okay. So I'm hoping and trusting that you've watched the YouTube video clip that I posted on the D6 Communicator under Advanced Program English, Victorian Era. It's a 55-minute lecture. It's a long one, so it's about a lesson. But I feel that it really, you know, gives you a holistic perspective of what Victorian thinking was like during that time. It'll give you a good grounding and understanding of kind of where Hopkins and Tennyson was coming from, kind of the prevailing attitudes and thoughts and concerns that these two poets had, and that kind of come out in their writing. So I'm hoping you've watched that YouTube clip. I've also added there an article, quite a brief article on the Victorian era, so that I'm hoping at this point you have a little bit of a better idea about that school of poetry. It is important for your AP exam that you have a good understanding of the era of Victorianism, so that you can, when you are analyzing the poetry, to answer the question, that you bring in your knowledge of this Victorian era. Okay, so today we're going to focus on Lord Tennyson's poem Ulysses, and so I've got a nice little nifty little picture of him right there. Usually they put the pictures of the old dudes, but you know, most of these dead white guys, as a lot of you guys would like to put it, were young, warm-blooded, you know, boys, just like you and me. And so there's quite a flattering picture, I think, of Tennyson. So let's look at his poem Ulysses. So the first thing you got to know is that Ulysses is written in the form of a dramatic monologue. Now, dramatic monologues are poems where the speaker is also the subject of the poem, in this case Ulysses, and that they are narrating their thoughts. So it's deeply personal. It's often what they're thinking, what they're feeling about a particular issue. So because it is that personal and it's their own personal narrative, it is highly subjective. So often when you read a dramatic monologue, and what I'm going to encourage you to do when you read Ulysses is to keep that in mind. You know, this is a guy who's talking to somebody about himself. And you know the way we are, when we talk about ourselves, you got to kind of question the validity or the truthfulness of what we're saying, because we often tend to exaggerate good things, omit slightly more unflattering aspects of ourselves. We might have a very subjective perspective of something. So it's always going to be a single story. And I think what you're finding here is that exactly that is happening. So we will look at that. We're first going to do a very flat reading of the poem, just so that you understand the basic meaning and techniques used. And then afterwards we will go and look at how, you know, the fact that it's a dramatic monologue, how that influences just kind of how sincere and kind of how much of what Ulysses says, you know, we can actually take should take with a grain of salt. All right, and so it brings into question the sincerity of the content of the poem, the sincerity of the speaker, and therefore kind of there's a little bit of dramatic irony going on here, because you know Ulysses is gonna reveal what he's thinking and feeling about an issue, but we know that he has to be blind to a lot of the things that he perhaps unwittingly reveals about himself in the poem, because there's a lot of that you can read about into what Ulysses says about himself that I don't think he realizes he's revealing about himself. And so we see things about Ulysses that he might be blind to himself, and that is a form of dramatic irony. Okay, just a quick history on who Ulysses was, or Odysseus, a different name for him. So Ulysses is part of the kind of, you know, Greek mythology, the whole battle between the Spartans and the Trojans. If you've seen Troy, you'll know the story where the city of Troy was defeated by the Spartans. Ulysses was one of those warriors who fought in the Battle of Troy and actually defeated the city of Troy. It was actually Ulysses' whole mastermind plan, if you remember, to actually, he created this ruse where they would pretend like they are going to present Troy with this beautiful gift. They built this kind of 5-6 story high wooden horse that they said to the Trojans is a gift, a peace offering. And so they delivered this gigantic horse to the gates of Troy, and believing that this was a peace offering, the Trojans wheeled this large animal into their city, because it was highly fortified and closed off, and they wheeled this horse into their city, accepting this gift, not knowing that inside the horse, within its bowels, were hiding thousands of Spartan soldiers. And in the middle of the night, when all the Trojans were asleep, the Spartans kind of came out of the horse and razed the city to the ground. And that was all Ulysses' brainchild. So he was a highly revered, highly popular, very popular, highly revered, highly respected war general. But he was also the king of Ithaca. And by the time this poem starts, we see where Ulysses has returned from his voyage to Troy. It took him 20 years to reach Troy, to wage the war on Troy, and then make his way back to Ithaca. And, legend has it he got lost quite a few times on his way back to Ithaca. So by the time he reached the shores of Ithaca back home, it had taken 20 years. So, all right, so he's the king of Ithaca, and the poem starts where he has returned from his voyage and his adventures and his kind of his big victories. But it is 20 years later that he returns as king of Ithaca. All right, so let's dive into it. I hope that the font is big enough for you guys. So I'm just going to look through it. Remember, this is Ulysses speaking, and he says in the beginning, "It little profits that an idle king," that's himself, "by the still hearth," which is a fireplace, "among these barren crags," it's his environment, "matched with an aged wife, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race, that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me." So clearly he's complaining in these first few lines of his monologue. Maybe he's speaking to himself, maybe he's complaining to a buddy of his that he's connected with there, I don't know. But he says that there's no profit in this position for him. Being king of Ithaca, he's unsatisfied. There's no gratification or satisfaction for him being king of Ithaca. He calls it, it's obviously not a very exciting environment. I mean, you can imagine if you've been in a battle for larger part of 20 years, the thrill and adrenaline that accompanies that, and now you have to come back, and all you have to do is civic duty and check, are taxes being paid. And I can imagine that could be quite boring for somebody who's used to that high adrenaline lifestyle. And he says there's no profit. And he calls himself an idle king in line 1. So it's a king, he feels that he's a king that doesn't really do much. And he feels quite complacent and unchallenged and unexcited. He's an idle king. Idle meaning, no action. By the still hearth. The hearth is still. It is unadventurous. It is very mundane existence. Hearth, fireplace, maybe sitting in front of the fireplace, not much is happening, and he's bored out of his mind. Among these barren crags. Crags are rocky outcrops. He says it's barren. Barren means it's fruitless, it's dry. It doesn't yield any crops really, so it's not very profitable. It's perhaps not very beautiful. It's perhaps quite dry, quite literally. So a lot of negative, kind of dull images here. And then he's matched with an aged wife on top of it all. He left her probably when she was in her prime, beautiful, comes back 20 years later, and in his eyes, she's an old hag. So there's no sport in that. And then he says, on top of that, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race. He looks at his own people as being savages. Possibly not as educated as he is, or the people he's used to socializing with. Not as educated, not as experienced, not well traveled, um, and so he doesn't really feel. He obviously feels he's superior to them, and in many ways he probably is, and so there's no connection. Um, and he says this: all that they do is that they hoard and they sleep and they feed, and they know not me. So not a lot of respect for his own people. He doesn't feel a kinship with them, a connection with them. Their existence to him is very dull, very, I would say, almost animalistic. If you just hoard and sleep and feed, you almost get the sense that it's an animal. And so there's no connection. There is displeasure, there's a dissatisfaction for him. And he's complaining here. I want you to just note the rhythm of the line 3 and 4 and 5, where he says, I mete and dole unequal laws unto a savage race. That very regular pattern, also kind of just supposed to be to mimic this kind of predictable, regular, dull, mundane tediousness of his day-to-day civic duties. Moving on to the next part, and he says, I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. Now, lees is when you have kind of drunk a barrel of beer or wine, particularly, and you get to the bottom. Often at the bottom, there's kind of everything that's sunk to the bottom and crystallizes at the bottom, the yucky part. That's called the lees, the dregs of the wine, right at the bottom. And he says that he doesn't want to live a superficial, boring life where he's just going to hoard and sleep and feed like his people. He wants to live life to its fullest. Carpe diem, seize the day. And he doesn't feel he's doing that as King of Ithaca. And so he's a restless spirit. And so he wants to drink life to the least. I love that metaphor of life being a bottle of wine and completely finishing that wine till the very last bitter dregs at the bottom. That is a life fulfilled. All times I have enjoyed greatly. Now this is when he was on his escapades. I've enjoyed all the times greatly. I've suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone, on shore, and when through the scudding drifts is on the sea, the rainy Hyades vexed the dim sea. So in turbulent seas, tumultuous seas, when my life was on the line, I lived life at the edge, I didn't know if I would make it or not. That's the kind of life for him. And so he's gone through highs and lows, and it's been thrilling. It's been unpredictable. And that's the kind of life that he feels worth living, and that's not what he's come back to. And then he says, through all of those travels, I am become a name. So he has become famous throughout the Mediterranean, wherever about his conquests and his abilities and his skill, and everybody knows him there. And now he comes back to Ithaca, and people don't know much about him. And there wasn't email and Instagram and stuff, so they don't really know what he did abroad. They don't really know what his victories were, much about it. And they don't know him. And so they don't even admire him. He was a hero abroad. Here he's just a king. And so he misses that perhaps. Then he says, for always roaming with a hungry heart, much have I seen and known. So he's traveled extensively. He's a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. You can imagine that he's picked up along his journeys. And because he has this hungry heart to always roam the seas and newer territories, he's seen a lot. He knows a lot. He's a very knowledgeable man. And he explains what has gained him this experience. He says, cities of men and manners. So he's kind of experienced new cities with new civilizations, new ways of doing things, new traditions, new cultures, new climates, quite literally hotter, colder places, councils, different ways of governing, governments, myself not least. Okay, and he makes sure there to mention that, you know, he ranks as highly as all those other governments that he's met, that he's as civilized and as experienced and as knowledgeable as those other civilizations that he's come into contact with, and honored of them all. Okay, he makes it very clear that he's a well-respected, well-revered man himself, and drunk delight of battle with my peers. All right, brothers in arms, you know, you have a shared experience with your fellow soldiers. You have things in common. You can connect and bond over that. He doesn't have that anymore, and he certainly doesn't have that with his people. So he's drunk the delight of battle with his peers, far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. The ringing plains, obviously the clash of the swords, so that ring in the air. And then he says, I am a part of all that I have met. So clearly he's a changed man. I mean, you are a sum of your experiences, and for 20 years he's met all these different people and civilizations and new ways of doing things and probably advancement in science and I don't know what else. And so he's changed. He's come back a changed man, more mature, more knowledgeable. And so there really is no connection. I think he has no connection with his people. And he yearns to go back and rekindle those friendships and experience those victories again, experience that high again. So I am a part of all that I have met. Okay, he has changed. Yet, all experience is an arch where through gleams that untraveled world. So he's creating this metaphor of being on the sea, and there's this arch. You know, this arch is like an arch through which you can travel. And he says, you know, experience is like that. It's like this arch, and you're on your little boat and you sail through this arch. But every time you come close to the arch, it moves further away into the distance, so you can't quite catch it. So it says, all experience is an arch where through gleams that untraveled world. And if you notice, the untraveled world gleams. So it's enticing. It is almost alluring, something you cannot stay away from. And he says, you know, this untraveled world is what he desires to explore. But he says that the margins of this arch, the margins, the sides, keep kind of fading forever and ever when he moves. So it's almost like there's such a, I can't go back, wealth of things to explore that you can never exhaust it. There's so much out there to explore that just when you think you've gotten to the edge of the earth, there's more. And then in the next couple of lines, he says, how dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust. Okay, so it's almost like a sword that's never used, eventually starts to rust. And it's a pity because it's never been used to its full potential. And he's saying, as a king, I'm sitting here on my throne and I'm busy rusting. It says here to rust, unburnished. Unburnished is not used, not polished, made shiny, to be used, kept sharp. not to shine in use. So he feels like that. He feels like an unused weapon that's rusting and not being used to its full potential as a king in Ithaca. And those exclamation marks really just drive home the frustration, as though to breathe were life. And there's this expression that says, there's a difference between living and existing. And he says in Ithaca, that's what he's doing. He's merely breathing, existing. And that's no life. As though to breathe were life. Life piled on life. And that repetition there just gives us a sense of the tediousness that he feels about his current existence. Life piled on life, just one long, tedious life that doesn't end. We're all too little. Okay, it's just not enough to satisfy. And of one, to me, little remains. It says, little of his life remains. He's an old man. And he realizes he doesn't have a long time left. So a little of life to him remains. He's very acutely aware of that. He says, but even though I know I'm old and I don't have much time left, but every hour is saved from that eternal silence, death. He says, but he counts every minute, every second. He's going to make count before he gets to the end of his life. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence. Something more. A bringer of new things. Okay, that's what he wants to do with the last bit of his life. And he says, vile it were. Vile means it would be disgraceful, disgusting almost. And vile it were for some 3 sons, perhaps, I don't know, it's a time period here. And in that time period that he has left, these 3 sons that he's left, maybe it's 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, we don't know, but in that time, to store and hoard myself. And this gray spirit, gray could be literally old, could be depressed. This gray spirit himself, yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. He says, so he wants to be like that star that twinkles on the horizon, sinking, the sinking star, right on the horizon boundary of the planet. He says he would like to travel there. He wants to go there where that star goes, unrestricted, and you can just keep traveling. To follow knowledge, because the more you travel, the more you experience things, the more you learn, the more you grow. Then he almost kind of breaks out of his reverie and his kind of thought pattern, and it's almost as if he's talking to somebody, and he says, oh, and by the way, here's my son, mine own Telemachus. Okay, he has a young son with him, and he says, to whom I leave the scepter and the isle. So he's clearly said, I'm going to give this to my son. I'm giving my scepter that I hold, give him the island. He has to take over my job. I can't do this anymore. And then he describes his son. And he says, almost trying to contrast how his people see him versus how they see his son, and how his son is more fit for the job than he is. And in some way, we've got to give him some credit. This guy at least sees that he's not the best suited to this position. He's much more effective in battle. And so kudos to him for having that self-awareness that my son might do a better job than I am. Or maybe he unwittingly, by showing how good his son is to be king, showing how bad a king he really is, which is not that flattering. I don't think he realizes that. But he says, when he describes his son, he says that he's well loved of me. I love him. He's discerning to fulfill this labor. In other words, when you are discerning, you can judge between right and wrong. You're a good judge. Discerning to fulfill this labor, this job, by slow prudence. If you're prudent, you are wise, and you're calculating, and you don't sort of make mistakes. So by slow prudence, he's not rash, he's slow. So he's not rash like Ulysses and restless. By slow prudence, to make mild a rugged people. So he's best able to subjugate and subdue these people who, in Ulysses' mind, are rugged, uncivilized. And like he said in the beginning of the poem, that he hands out and doles out these laws. He doesn't really know how to hand them out fairly and how to civilize these people best. His son can. Carries on, and through soft degrees, in other words, not harsh punishments and unfair punishments, by being just, soft degrees, by being just, will subdue them to the useful and the good. So he can achieve much more with his people than Ulysses could. So it makes sense, rather give the position to him, and that will free him up to go and pursue his own desires. And he carries on and he says about his son, most blameless is he. So clearly Telemachus is without fault. Obviously he hasn't committed many maybe crimes, or in his character he's the kind of character of good virtue. So he's blameless. All these qualities that would make a good leader, I suppose. Centered in the sphere of common duties. He knows the job to be done. He knows the duties. He's in the thick of it. He doesn't shy away from his responsibility like his father. And then it says, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness. So he is a tender, gracious leader, and decent, and he trusts him to not to fail in these endeavors. And pay meet adoration to my household gods. Okay, and he's religious, and he supports kind of the religious sentiments of the time. So he's the perfect candidate when I am gone. So kind of with the word when, we get the sense he's already made his mind up that he's leaving. And then he says quite a curt line. He says, he works his work, I mine. So making it very clear that they are two very different people, suited to two very different occupations, and kind of a sense that they're not really close because they are so different. And then I like this. I mean, I always, when I start reading from this line to the end of this poem, I kind of get this sense that this just political rhetoric. It's this political candidate trying to sweep up his people to go into battle, or like in those Braveheart movies, or Aragorn in Lord of the Rings trying to kind of motivate his troops to go and sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And so he becomes a little lyrical, a little romantic here, a little fanciful, and he says, there lies the port. So he's obviously looking out of his window and he sees where the ship is docked, with the port and the sea. It's calling to him, and he says, there lies the port. The vessel, the ship, the vessel puffs her sail. The wind is in the sail and she's ready to sail. There gloom the dark, broad seas, the challenge that awaits me. He says, my mariners, these are the people who sailed with him, my mariners, souls that have toiled, that means working very hard, and wrought, battled, and thought with me. So you can see already there's a connection with these people. They've worked with him, battled with him, suffered with him, thought with him, much more in common with them. That ever with a frolic is being happy, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine. So these people were brave enough and quite happy to experience the highs and the lows with him, the thunder and the sunshine, and opposed free hearts free foreheads, gave all of themselves. And he says, you and I are old. So whether it's a friend he's speaking to, I don't know. But you and I are old. But old age has yet its honor and its toil. He says, I know we are old, but we're not done yet. Old people can still be useful. It can still be an honorable thing to be old because you are wise and experienced and you still have something to offer. Old age hath yet its honor and its toil. Don't throw us away just yet. Death closes all. We're all going to die. We know that. But something ere the end. Ere means before. So we're all going to die. We're old, we know that. But just one little adventure before that happens. But something before the end. Some work of noble note may yet be done. He says, I can still do something good. I can still maybe fight one more battle. Some work of noble note may yet be done. Not unbecoming men that strove with gods. Okay. He reminds himself here and his fellows that they strove with gods, with Achilles and Hercules. They were all part of the Battle of Troy. And so they are certainly worth that much. And have that going for them. And then he becomes a little more nostalgic. He says the lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. Maybe it's becoming nighttime. Maybe he's just alluding again to his old age and death closing in. But the lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes. Again, ambiguous there. Is it just it's becoming nighttime now? Or the long day of his life is drawing to a close? The long day wanes. The slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, it is not too late to seek a newer world. Push off, and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows, the waves, with your paddles, sitting in the boat in neat little rows in order. Smite those waves with your oars. Smite the sounding furrows, the waves, like deliberately. For my purpose holds. I remain committed to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. Very inspirational, very motivational, this determination and purpose and passion that he has. And then here I can hear kind of Churchill, when he said, we will fight them on the beaches, to the British to get them to fight in the Second World War. I can hear him here and he says, it may be that the gulfs will wash us down. Okay, we'll drown, eh? It may be we shall touch the happy isles, which is the Greek mythological heaven. We'll touch the happy isles, that might be, and see the great Achilles, because he's dead. See the great Achilles whom we knew. Might happen, might die. Though much is taken from us, we've lost a lot. Though much is taken, much abides. He says there's still a lot left. And though we are not now that strength which in the old days moved earth and heaven, okay, we're not as strong as we were. We're not the mighty heroes we used to be. But even though that which we are, we are. Okay. Yes, we're not that strong, but we are many more things than that. Experienced, valorous, revered, skillful warriors. Might not be that strong, but we got to embrace what we are and use what we can. And what does he say we are? Let's look at the last 3 lines. We are what? One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Yield meaning giving up. So that is what they are. They're old, but their passion is alive, their desire is strong, their will is there, and that counts for something. And that their will is what? To strive, to seek, to find, and never to give up. And this last line is probably one of the most famous lines in all Victorian poetry: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. All right, so it's a beautiful, it's just a beautiful narrative. So that was the flat reading of it. So I can't go back. All right, so maybe I'll send another clip with kind of the poetic techniques used in the poem. But, so when you have a flat reading of this poem, it's just this king unsatisfied with coming back to a very mundane, tedious existence. He knows he has responsibilities there, but he doesn't really know how to do them properly. He doesn't know his people. He has no connection with his wife. He is a soldier, and he longs for that life. He wants to go back to it. And he sees his son who's fit for the job, explains that he has all the characteristics and qualities that would make a good leader, and kind of, I think, is very candid about the fact that he isn't. He is something quite different. He's as successful, but in another arena. And then he kind of inspires and motivates his mariners, his fellow shipmates and warriors to go back for one last push, one final adventure, which on the face of it, I do think, when a lot of people read this poem, study this poem, they feel uplifted and motivated, and this is a tale of heroism and courage and victory, and it's almost a struggle against giving in to weakness and old age and depression. But I think what is important to remember is that Tennyson wrote this poem right after his best friend died, Arthur Henry Hallam, and he sunk into a major depression when he wrote a lot of the poems that I'm going to do with you, this one and the next one, In Memoriam, that he wrote to his friend. He was in a very deep, dark depression, and so one has to bear that in mind when you read Ulysses. And some would say that perhaps this poem was kind of his way of willing himself out of depression and despair, of kind of struggling against being overwhelmed by all the doubts and fears and uncertainties that not just his friend's death, Arthur Hallam's death, brought about. Because when someone close to you dies, you kind of think you've dealt with the idea of your own mortality and death. But every time somebody close to you dies, it resurfaces, and you start asking all these questions again. How can a loving God let people die? And all those existential questions we have about mortality and life and existence and God. And so that obviously resurfaced. And so perhaps when you read Ulysses again, bear that in mind, because it might make sense to you, why he's picked the character of Ulysses, perhaps as a foil for what he's experiencing at the moment, and that this need to inhabit a character who has a will to live and a thirst for life, and who despite the sufferings and the turmoil and the threats on his life, and the problems that he experiences, still refuses to be swallowed by that. And like he mentions in the poem, the tumultuous, turbulent seas, and that there's constantly this idea of death staring him in the face. yet he finds it within himself to push on and to triumph over that. And perhaps it was kind of Tennyson's kind of need for that kind of attitude to life, that it was inspired by the character of Ulysses, who he would have known a lot about, that he might have admired, that will to fight and strive and carry on despite your doubts and your fears and your struggles, and your questions, your despair. So that's one thing I think that's important to know when you read Ulysses again, is that that's where kind of Tennyson was at emotionally. But also it's important to remember that he wrote in the Victorian times, and the prevailing kind of like, if you remember, there was a lot of, there was the age of exploration, and that's why I think this is such a fitting poem as well, because it deals with exploring, conquering territories. It was a time where there was a lot of exploration, discovering new lands, discovering new species. It was a time when Darwin came about with his kind of the theory of evolution that kind of upended a lot of and challenged a lot of kind of orthodox religious views on man and God and the plan, a big plan and destiny. And Darwin's theories came and said, look, there's none of that. We are all just randomly here, randomly. There's no God. There's no higher purpose for your life. You are not because there was this belief in the Victorian times that you are the paragon of the animals. You are the epitome of all the species, and you are created by God to look after planet Earth, that's your dominion, and you have to restrain it, look after it, almost kind of using that as a justification for all colonialism. We, especially the British Empire, thought they were the paragon of virtue. They were the pinnacle of all the species, and therefore have a right to subdue and civilize, like Ulysses says, the savage race. Tame them, subdue them, is what he's saying Telemachus must do with them. And so there was this whole idea that maybe we got it wrong. Maybe there isn't a divine purpose for our lives. Maybe there isn't a destiny for us. Maybe we're just all here randomly. And so there is no meaning really to your life and to your death. It just is. And so that creates a lot of uncertainty and doubt and despair and questioning, and you see that in a lot of Tennyson's poetry. So bearing that in mind, you've got to look at this poem as well as looking at a man desperately trying to find purpose in his life again, meaning in his life again. And for a Victorian who's, like Tennyson, staunchly Christian, and now having to contend with thinking that perhaps your life has no significant higher meaning, is quite despairing. And maybe this struggle to try and make sense of your life again, give meaning to your existence, like Ulysses is trying to do. What is life, and what does it mean to really live? And are we as important as we used to think we are? Or are we just like the animals? And, so the place of man in the larger scheme of things, we see Ulysses struggle with it. Tennyson certainly struggled with that question. And so one has to ask, how does Tennyson feel about Ulysses? Does he see him as this hero who just will not give up in the face of kind of challenges, one who can triumph over tumultuous seas and battles and reign victoriously? And that kind of is looking up to that kind of character in an age of doubt and despair and not knowing what your purpose of your existence even is. Maybe there's an admiration there for a character like that. But I think, there's also another school of thought that says, well, maybe Ulysses represents British imperialism, British arrogance, um, you know, everything that's wrong with this idea that we are, you know, by God chosen to rule. Because if you remember, a lot of Christian thinking was, and very innocently so, that God has mandated us to go and disciple the world, make fishers, you know, we're fishers of men, and convert everybody. And that kind of became justification for colonialism, that we are going to go, and imperialism means we go out from England and we conquer all kinds of other territories and lands and make them Christian, make them British, make them civilized. God has given us that duty. That's our Christian duty. And so it was a very innocent mission, but a very damaging and harmful one. And so kind of is Tennyson perhaps looking at British imperialism as something that, you know, we've got to reevaluate if that was in fact God's mandate to us, and whether we've handled that right, and if there really was a higher purpose to the British Empire, and if, you know. So is he critically looking at British imperialistic attitudes of the Victorian era, that we can just, because that's what happened, they just went out and they conquered places, took places, subdued them, made them British, made them Christian, because there is an arrogance in this poem, on this part of Ulysses. And so does Tennyson see him as just this arrogant fool who believed what the Victorians always believed about man's purpose, and that he's second to God, and, you know, or is he just a fool in the face of evolutionist thinking and more scientific thinking, that it's all random and there is no higher quest or higher purpose, and life and death is just that, and that's the end of it. You know, or is Tennyson straddling the two views and not sure for himself? So is this a tale of heroism, or is it perhaps a subtler criticism of prevailing Victorian attitudes of man's station and man's place in the big scheme of things? Points to ponder. I hope it didn't bore you too much. This was a whole lesson worth. Okay, have a good holiday, have a good break. This was fun.